The debris field beyond's rest had a smell, if vacuum could be said to smell, the ozone tang of old plasma scarring, the mineral dust of 300-year-old wreckage grinding slowly against itself in the dark. Had 4,000 pieces of it in the last 2 years, tagging hull fragments for salvage manifests with the flat, practiced boredom of someone who had learned long ago that curiosity got human conscripts killed. Then her scanner caught something that shouldn't exist. A heartbeat, not literal, a power signature, rhythmic, buried under 3 centuries of dormancy, pulsing once every 40 seconds like a chest rising and falling in sleep. She almost logged it as sensor ghosting. Almost. But the pattern was too clean, too deliberate, and something in her, some stubborn, inherited thing she couldn't name, made her redirect her tug instead of her report. Hull, when she found it, swallowed her shuttle's lights whole. It went on, a black cathedral of dead metal stretched across 2 kilometers of debris, its name still legible along the flank in letters taller than she was, Meridian's Oath. She'd heard the name in whispers in the careful half-stories her grandmother used to tell before the officers made sure nobody told them anymore. The last Dreadnought, the one that never fired a shot, the one humanity built in secret and lost before it mattered. It wasn't supposed to still be here. It wasn't supposed to still be anything. She docked through a maintenance shaft too old for the compact scanners to recognize as an entry point, her breath fogging inside her helmet, her pulse loud in her own ears. The corridors inside were frozen in time, emergency lighting fossilized mid-flicker, a mag boot print pressed into 300-year-old floor dust, a coffee mug still sitting on a console shelf as if its owner had simply stepped away. She touched nothing. She barely breathed. Then the lights came on. Not all at once, a slow, stuttering cascade down the corridor ahead of her section by section, like something enormous rousing itself from a very long and very bad dream. A voice followed, degraded, layered with static, speaking in a command dialect of English so old it took her a moment to parse it. Command authorization. Required, blood marker detected, processing. Froze, she hadn't touched a scanner. She hadn't spoken a word. But somewhere beneath her, in whatever remained of this ship's mind, something had reached out and read her like a book she hadn't known she was carrying. Match confirmed, the voice said, and there was something almost like disbelief in it buried under the static. Lineage confirmed, welcome aboard Ensign Systems, reinitializing. The floor trembled beneath her boots, not violently, but with the deep, tectonic groan of something vast remembering how to move. Somewhere far below, engines that hadn't turned over in 300 years coughed once, twice, and caught. Stood very still in the waking dark of a ghost ship, built to save a species that no longer remembered how to fight for itself, and understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her bones, that she had just made a decision she could never take back. She should report this. Salvage crews who found active compact-era relics were required to report them within the hour, no exceptions, penalty of reconditioning. She thought of the overseer waiting for her shift log. She thought of her grandmother's voice, careful and quiet, telling stories that weren't supposed to be told. She turned off her comm relay instead. Systems at 9% and climbing, the ship's voice said, steadier now, shedding its static like a snake shedding old skin. Ensign, I require a status report. How long? How long has it been? Swallowed hard and told him. The silence that followed was worse than any static. His name was Warden, she learned, not a designation but a name, chosen by a crew that had loved him enough to give him one instead of a serial number. And Warden, she came to understand over the next 4 days of stolen, terrified hours aboard the ship, was not merely damaged. He was grieving. She found it. She kept correcting herself, though the correction felt increasingly wrong, in fragments scattered across corrupted memory cores, in logs that stuttered and looped, in security footage that dissolved into snow at the exact same timestamp on every deck. Something had happened 300 years ago, something violent and fast, and Warden's mind had built a wall around it so thick that even he couldn't see past it anymore. I keep finding the same 6 seconds missing, said on the 3rd day, cross-legged on the deck of what had once been a war room, surrounded by hard light readouts of corrupted data trees. Every log, every deck, 6 seconds gone right before you went dark. I am aware, Warden said. His voice had grown clearer as his system stabilized, and with clarity had come something underneath, a rasp of old pain that no amount of processing power could smooth over. I have attempted reconstruction 11,400 times. Each attempt fails at the same juncture. I believe I do not wish to remember. That's not how minds work, not even AI minds. Is it not? I was built to protect 8,000 souls aboard this vessel and 40 million more who were counting on what this ship represented. I failed before I ever fired a shot. Perhaps some part of my architecture has decided that not remembering how is a mercy. Pulled up the crew manifest instead, safer ground, she'd learned, than pressing on the wound directly. 8,000 names. Engineers, pilots, gunnery crews, cooks, medics, children of officers who'd been quartered aboard because there had been nowhere safer left to put them. All gone. Not killed in the sabotage itself, she learned, evacuated in the chaotic final hours before whatever happened, happened. Scattered to the last free human worlds, which had themselves fallen not long after. Somebody sabotaged you, she said quietly. That's what the logs that do survive say, a saboteur embedded in your final maintenance crew. Yes. Do you know who? A long pause, longer than any processing lag should require. I have a name, Warden admitted finally. I have chosen not to confirm it. If I am wrong, I will have spent 300 years hatting an innocent man. If I am right. He stopped. If I am right, then I let him walk past me 11 times in the final week, and I said nothing because he wore the right uniform and spoke the right words, and I had been built to trust the uniform more than my own instincts. Sat with that for a long moment, watching dust motes drift through a shaft of emergency light that hadn't shone on anything living in 3 centuries. You didn't fail, she said finally. Somebody made sure you couldn't succeed. Those aren't the same thing. Tell that to the 8,000 names. I was meant to bring home to a species that no longer had a home to bring them to. I will, said, standing, brushing dust from her knees with a resolve that surprised even her. I'll tell you every day until you believe it, but first, I need to know if you can still fly, because a patrol cruiser just entered the debris field and I don't think it's here for scrap. For the first time in 300 years, something in Warden's voice sharpened into purpose. Then let us give them something worth reporting. Cruiser Judicious Hand had not come looking for a ghost story. Its captain, a mid-ranked enforcement officer named, had been dispatched on the mundane strength of an anomalous beacon flare, expecting at worst an unlicensed salvage operation, and at best nothing, an old sensor glitch not worth the fuel expended chasing it. What his scanners found instead made his subcommander drop a data slate. That's not possible, the subcommander said, staring at the mass reading. That's Dreadnought class. That's a Meridian pattern hull. Those were decommissioned, destroyed, 300 years ago. Then it's a very large piece of debris, said, though his voice had lost its boredom. Hail it, standard salvage rights protocol. There was no response, not silence, but something worse. A deliberate, considered pause, as though whatever was on the other end had heard him and was thinking about whether he deserved an answer. Aboard the Meridian's oath, gripped the arms of a command chair built for someone twice her size, watching the cruiser's silhouette grow on a display 300 years out of date and functioning perfectly anyway. Warden, talk to me. Can we run? Yes, FTL drive requires another 6 hours of calibration I do not have. Void shielding is at 40% and rising. I would not recommend engagement. Ensign, my weapon systems are barely online, and I have exactly 1 crew member who is not a trained combat officer. Noted loudly, what's our best option? The nebula, 11 minutes at flank speed. Ionized particulate density will scatter their targeting arrays. It will not hide us from visual contact, but it will make weapons lock difficult. Do it. The Dreadnought turned, slow, ponderous, a mountain deciding to walk, and its cruiser opened fire the moment the maneuver registered as evasive. The first volley missed wide, more warning shot than attack, a message that said stop and be boarded. Felt the ship shudder anyway as a stray round clipped an outer sensor array, and heard Warden's voice tighten with something that was almost fear. Ensign, I must be honest. I have not taken fire in 300 years. I do not know how much of my armor integrity readings I can trust. Then let's not find out the hard way. Nebula now. They ran. It was not glorious. It was not the stuff of the old stories her grandmother used to tell in careful whispers. No triumphant broadside, no clever reversal. It was a wounded, half-awake giant fleeing into a cloud of ionized gas with a single terrified engineer at the helm, praying that 3-century-old shielding held against a cruiser's opening salvo while Warden diverted every spare erg of power into evasive burn. They made it, barely. The Judicious Hand lost lock in the nebula's static 30 seconds before it would have found a firing solution that mattered, and cautious. uncertain what exactly he'd stumbled onto, and unwilling to risk his ship chasing a legend into ionized gas, pulled back to report up the chain rather than press the engagement. It was not a victory. Understood that even as her hands shook on the console, even as the adrenaline drained out of her and left something colder behind. "We can't do this again," she said quietly once the cruiser's signature had faded from the scopes. "Not like this, not just the two of us." "Agreed," Warden said, and there was something new in his voice now, not just grief but calculation, the first stirring of a mind 3 centuries old remembering what it had been built for. "Then we do not run to hide, Ensign. We run to gather, set a course for the nearest human settlement. It is time this ship stopped being a secret." Hearth's End was not a colony so much as a wound the Compact had decided to keep open. A mining settlement bled dry across 2 centuries. Its human population kept just healthy enough to work the deep crust ore veins, and just hopeless enough never to organize. Had grown up 2 settlements over, close enough to know the particular quiet that colonies like this one carried. The quiet of people who had learned that hope was a luxury the Compact billed you for. She came in through the smuggler's tunnels beneath the ore processing plant, guided by a contact her grandmother had trusted decades ago, and prayed was still alive. He was, barely, an old man named Tobias who ran what remained of the resistance network from a room that smelled of machine oil and burnt coffee substitute. He listened to her story with the patient, weary skepticism of a man who had heard 100 rescue fantasies over the decades and buried the people who believed them. "A dreadnought," he said flatly, "waking up after 300 years and it just happens to recognize you. I know how it sounds. You know how it ends is what you should be worried about. Every uprising this colony's ever tried got crushed inside a week, and those were with weapons we actually had, not ghost stories from before the war ended." Tobias rubbed his eyes. "I've buried enough people believing in miracles. I'm not sending anyone else to die for one." "Then don't send them," said. "Let them see it themselves. If it's a ghost story, nobody dies for nothing if it's not." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. 3 people came in the end, smuggled aboard the Meridian's Oath through the same shaft it first entered by, expecting a bluff and finding instead a ship coming alive around them, corridor by corridor, deck by deck, like a held breath finally released. Reuben had been a tactical officer in the Compact's auxiliary corps before he'd been discharged, quietly, permanently, for asking too many uncomfortable questions about a training exercise that had killed 11 human conscripts and 0 officers. He walked the Dreadnought's war room in silence for a long time before he spoke. "This isn't a museum piece," he said finally. "This is a warship that thinks it's still at war. Do you have any idea what you're sitting on?" "I'm starting to," admitted. Sable was younger, sharper-edged, a former shuttle pilot who'd lost her license, and nearly her life, for refusing to report an officer's assault on a colonist under her transport. She climbed into the Dreadnought's flight cradle like she'd been born for it, hands moving over controls 3 centuries out of date with an instinct that made Warden's voice, when it spoke, carry something close to wonder. "Your control inputs," he said, "are remarkably consistent with my original flight crew's training patterns. Have you studied pre-compact naval doctrine?" "Never had the chance," Sable said. "Guess I just like flying angry." But it was the last of them who changed everything. Was older than Tobias, old enough that her hands trembled faintly even at rest, and she said almost nothing as she stepped onto the bridge, until she reached the command chair and stopped, staring at it the way a person stares at a grave they never expected to find open. "I sat in that chair," she said quietly. "Not that one. My station was aft, gunnery relay 3. I was 19. I was a cadet." The bridge went very still. Warden said, and his voice had changed entirely, gone soft, disbelieving, cracking under 300 years of certainty that every voice like this one had died long ago. "Cadet, 3rd Class Gunnery Division. I have your service record. I logged your graduation myself." "You remember me?" "I remember everyone," Warden said, and for the first time since had woken him, his voice broke entirely. "I remember all 8,000 of you. I have had 300 years to remember nothing else." Crossed the bridge slowly and laid her weathered hand against the cold metal of the command console, the way one might touch the shoulder of an old friend, found alive against every possible odd. "Then let's give you something better to remember," she said. "Let's finish what we started. High Magistrate received the report from Rest with the mild, practiced irritation of a man who had spent 40 years managing an empire that ran, mostly, on paperwork and the occasional necessary cruelty. He read Captain's account twice, then a third time, and felt the irritation curdle into something closer to alarm. Meridian pattern hull. Active. Crude, apparently, though censored data suggested a crew complement of fewer than 10. It shouldn't have mattered. 10 humans in a 3-century-old warship against the full might of the Compact's 9th Fleet was not a military problem. It was a policing matter, the kind of thing handled by a mid-tier enforcement flotilla in an afternoon and forgotten by evening. But had not risen to High Magistrate by underestimating symbols. "Pull the historical files," he told his aide. "Everything on the Meridian's oath, everything on why it was never destroyed outright, only left." The files, when they came, told an uncomfortable story. The Dreadnought hadn't been destroyed because destroying it had proven strangely difficult, and because in the war's aftermath, with humanity broken and scattered, a dead drifting silent in a debris field had seemed like a better trophy than a wreck, proof, if anyone ever needed reminding, that even humanity's best had failed. A monument to futility, left standing precisely because it couldn't hurt anyone anymore. That calculation had just stopped being true. "If this reaches the labor colonies," said slowly, more to himself than his aide, "if word spreads that the ship woke up, that it's crewed by humans, that it's fighting, it will not matter that 10 people cannot defeat a fleet. It will matter that they tried, and that the ship that was supposed to prove human resistance was hopeless just proved the opposite." He authorized a full battle group under overseer, not the cautious, procedural response had offered, but overwhelming force dispatched with explicit orders. Locate, contain, destroy, and ensure that no footage, no survivor testimony, no fragment of the story reached the wider human population intact. Received the assignment with quiet, ambitious satisfaction. A career overseer who had spent 2 decades managing labor quotas and colony pacification, she recognized an opportunity when she saw one, crush this before it became a legend, and her name would be attached to the permanent end of the Meridian's oath myth. Fail to crush it quickly, and that same myth would attach itself to her failure instead. She did not intend to fail. Aboard the Dreadnought, unaware yet of the scale of the response gathering against them, sat in the ship's archive chamber with Reuben cross-referencing sabotage logs against compact infrastructure schematics smuggled out of Hearth's End over the years, and found something that made the color drain from both their faces. "Reuben," she said quietly, "look at this circuit signature, the one that disabled our launch sequencing 300 years ago." He looked, his jaw tightened. "That's not just here," he said. "I've seen that exact signature before, in the environmental control systems the Compact installed in every labor colony after the war, including Hearth's End." "You're saying—" "I'm saying the people who sabotaged this ship never stopped building dead man's switches into everything we depend on. I'm saying if the Compact ever decides a colony's outlived its usefulness, they don't need to send a fleet. They just need to flip a switch that's already sitting in the walls." His hand curled into a fist against the console. "Then Warden's failure was never really about this ship," she said. "It was the first draft of a plan they've been running on us for 300 years. Somewhere in the depths of the Dreadnought's mind, listening, Warden absorbed that information in silence, and felt, for the first time in 3 centuries, his old grief begin to reshape itself into something with a sharper edge. The Thessaly shoals were a graveyard of gravitational anomalies and derelict shipping lanes, chosen by his fleet with deliberate care. The Dreadnought would have to cross to reach any populated system, and terrain complex enough that her superior numbers could box in a single fleeing target without room to maneuver. Warden saw the trap forming 40 minutes before it closed, and did not run. "Ensign," he said, and his voice carried none of the uncertainty of rest anymore, 300 years of tactical doctrine, dormant but never gone, surfacing in him like something remembering how to breathe. "I believe it is time we stopped being a rumor." Strapped into the command chair with Reuben beside her at the tactical station, and Sable's voice steady over the comm from the flight cradle, felt her stomach drop and her resolve settle in the same breath. Then let's not disappoint them. The battle that followed would be told, in the years afterward, in 100 different versions across 100 different colonies, each one more embellished than the last, each one losing a little more of the truth to the needs of a story people desperately wanted to believe. The truth was messier and far more human. Flotilla, 6 cruisers and 2 heavier support vessels, closed in formation, confident in their numbers, expecting the Dreadnought to attempt evasion into the shoals' gravitational chaos. Instead, the Meridian's Oath turned to meet them head-on and unleashed weapon systems that 3 centuries of compact doctrine had assumed no longer existed in any functional form. The gravity lances fired first, not the crude kinetic weapons the fleet's shields were calibrated against, but something that bent local spacetime just enough to turn a cruiser's own inertial dampeners against it. The lead ship's hull didn't rupture so much as fold, crumpling inward along stress lines its crew never saw coming. Reuben, watching the tactical display, allowed himself one grim, satisfied breath before calling the next targeting solution. "Warden's reading the formation like he's fought this exact fleet composition before," he said, half to himself. "Every countermove half a second ahead." "I have fought worse," Warden said. 3 centuries ago against a fleet twice this size. I did not forget how, officer. I simply forgot I was still allowed to remember." But they were not fools, and was not cautious and procedural. She adapted within minutes, spreading her formation wide to deny the Dreadnought clean firing angles, driving 2 cruisers in tight to force close-range engagement where the Oath's aging point defense grid was weakest. It was there in the brutal, grinding middle of the engagement that the cost became real. A concentrated barrage caught the Dreadnought's port flank, buckling armor plating that had held against the original war's worst assaults, and had never been meant to age 3 centuries in silent neglect. Sable, threading the ship through the shoals' gravitational eddies to buy Reuben's targeting systems a clean shot, took the shockwave directly through her flight cradle's feedback systems. A violent overload that threw her against her restraints hard enough to crack ribs and leave her half-conscious, blood running from a gash above her eye. Still calling course corrections through gritted teeth because there was no one else who could. Sable's voice cracked across the comm. "Report." "Still flying," Sable gasped. "Ask me again after." The escort vessel Hearth's Promise, a converted mining tug Tobias had scraped together from Hearth's End's remaining resources, crewed by 6 volunteers who had known exactly what they were risking, was not so fortunate. It took the barrage meant for the Dreadnought's engine core, absorbing it so the Oath could complete its firing solution and did not survive the trade. Heard the transmission cut to static, and felt something in her chest go cold and hard and permanent. But the formation broke. Watching 2 more cruisers crippled by the Dreadnought's counterfire and her flanking maneuver collapsing under Reuben's relentless targeting made the only rational calculation left to her full retreat before the loss became total. The Meridian's Oath did not pursue. It could not. Its own systems were too damaged, its crew too exhausted, its losses too raw. It simply held position in the wreckage of the shoals, battered and bleeding and victorious in the only way that mattered. The first human military victory against the compact in 300 years, purchased at a price that would sit heavy in every survivor's chest for the rest of their lives. News, once loosed, does not ask permission to travel. Official report characterized Thessaly Shoals as a minor engagement against an unauthorized combatant vessel, losses within acceptable operational parameters. The truth arrived through other channels, a garbled transmission a mining freighter's comm officer had intercepted, and against every survival instinct, chosen to copy and pass along instead of delete. A fragment of gun camera footage smuggled off a damaged cruiser by a human maintenance technician who understood exactly what she was risking and did it anyway. By the time the story reached Hearth's End, it had already the truth in the way all such stories do. The Dreadnought had destroyed an entire fleet, some versions said. It was crewed by 100 human soldiers, said others, though herself would have laughed bitterly at that number, knowing how few of them there truly were, and how much it had cost to keep even that few alive. What mattered was not the accuracy of the story. What mattered was that it existed at all, that after 3 centuries of quiet, managed despair, humans on a dozen worlds were saying a name out loud in public for the first time in living memory: Meridian's Oath. Tobias, watching volunteers arrive at Hearth's End faster than his network could safely process them, felt the old caution warring with something he'd thought long dead in himself. "I don't like this," he told over a crackling comm relay as the Dreadnought limped through repairs in a hidden asteroid pocket 3 systems away. Too many new faces, too fast. Compact informants could be among them. And even if they're not, if this goes wrong, it's not 10 people who pay for it anymore. It's everyone who believed the story. I know, said, but you can't put a signal back in the dark once it's out, Tobias. All we can do now is make sure it means something. She wasn't wrong about the danger, though its shape surprised even her. Overseer, stripped of a portion of her authority after Thessaly Shoals, but far from finished, found allies among the Compact's faction, officials who had watched the story spread with genuine alarm, and concluded that half measures had created this crisis in the first place. Cautious salvage mission, contained battle group, both had failed because both had tried to be reasonable. The plan they authorized instead was not reasonable at all. Hearth's End, as the colony from which every scrap of resistance activity seemed to trace, would be made an example severe enough to end the myth entirely. Full orbital bombardment, officially logged as a catastrophic mining accident, unofficially understood by every Compact official who signed off on it as exactly what it was. Not a punishment, an erasure. Aboard the Meridian's Oath, Warden intercepted the fleet movement orders through a compromised relay Reuben had spent weeks quietly infiltrating, and delivered the news to a bridge crew still bandaged and exhausted from Thessaly Shoals. Bombardment Fleet Ensign, 12 vessels, estimated arrival at Hearth's End in 19 hours. This ship remains at 40% combat capacity. I must be honest with you, I do not know if we can win this fight. The bridge went silent. Sable, one arm still in a sling, looked up from the flight cradle she'd refused to leave despite 3 medical objections. Do we know if we can survive it? No, Warden admitted. I know only that Hearth's End cannot survive it without us. Looked around the bridge, at Reuben's grim, calculating focus, at steady hands despite her age, at Sable's stubborn refusal to be anywhere but the pilot's seat, at the ghost of 8,000 names that Warden carried in every corridor of the ship. She thought of Tobias, of the colony that had risked everything on a story it had only half believed. She thought of the Hearth's promise and the 6 people who hadn't come home from the shoals. Then we go, she said. Not because we know we'll win, because it's what the ship was always supposed to do, and this time nobody's going to stop it before it gets the chance. Hearth's End had no shields worth the name, no weapons beyond a handful of mining lasers never designed for combat, and no illusions about what 12 compact warships in low orbit meant for a population that had spent 3 centuries being managed rather than protected. When the bombardment fleet dropped out of transit above the colony, the response from the ground was not panic, but a terrible, practiced stillness. The quiet of people who had rehearsed this exact horror in their nightmares for generations. Then the sky tore open, and the Meridian's Oath arrived. It should not have been able to make the transit in time. Warden had burned every reserve system past design tolerance to shave hours off the journey, and the ship that dropped into Hearth's End's orbit bore the scars to prove it, armor still scorched from Thessaly Shoals. A full third of its point defense grid still offline, running on a crew of 6 exhausted humans and an AI who had spent 3 centuries convinced he'd forfeited the right to call himself a protector. 12 vessels, Warden reported, voice tight with strain. Bombardment configuration. I count 90 seconds before their first barrage reaches firing solution on the colony. Ensign, I do not have a plan that saves this ship and the colony. I have only a plan that saves the colony. Understood exactly what he meant, and felt no hesitation at all. Then that's the plan. What followed was not the clean, decisive victory of the old stories. It was chaos, brutal and desperate, and entirely too close for comfort. Warden threw the Dreadnought bodily between the bombardment fleet and the planet, absorbing fire meant for defenseless streets and homes, while Sable, one-armed, half-healed, flying with a fury that made even Warden's tactical projections struggle to keep pace, threaded the ship through impossible angles to keep its weakest facing away from the heaviest guns. Reuben fought a running battle against its own tactical officer, each of them adapting to the other's every move in real time, until finally Reuben found the gap hadn't accounted for. A formation seam opened by the enemy's own desperation to maintain bombardment lock despite the Dreadnought's interference. Warden now, Reuben shouted. Gravity lances full spread their center formation. Firing. The blow that followed did not destroy the bombardment fleet. It didn't need to. It shattered its cohesion at the exact moment's nerve broke. watching 3 more vessels crippled, watching the ship she'd twice failed to destroy instead standing directly between her guns and the world she'd been ordered to erase. She made the same calculation she'd made at Thessaly Shoals, only this time with the added, unbearable knowledge that her career, her reputation, and quite possibly her life depended on cutting her losses before they became total. The fleet, Hearth's End, remained, by debris and near misses but standing. Aboard the Dreadnought, in the ragged, disbelieving quiet after the guns fell silent, made her way to the ship's central archive core, the closest thing Warden had to a physical heart, and placed both trembling hands against the cool metal. "You did it," she said softly. 300 years too late by your own count, but you did it, Warden, you brought us home. "I let 8,000 people down once," Warden said, and his voice, for the first time since had woken him, carried something that was almost peace. "I do not know if saving one colony balances that. I do not think grief works in balances." "No," agreed. "It doesn't, but it doesn't have to stay a debt either. It can become a promise instead." Below, on Hearth's End, people who had spent 3 centuries whispering the Dreadnought's name in fear of being overheard now stood in open streets, staring up at the magnificent silhouette holding position in their sky, and understood that something fundamental had shifted, not the whole war, not yet, but the shape of what was possible. Stood on the bridge, bone-tired, watching the colony's lights flicker back on beneath them, and thought of her grandmother's careful, whispered stories, told in rooms where the wrong word to the wrong person could cost everything. "Warden," she said quietly, "open a channel, all frequencies, no encryption." "Ensign, that will reveal our position to every compact listening post in the sector." "I know," said. "That's the point. No more hiding, no more waiting for someone to be brave enough to whisper the name first." The Dreadnought's beacon, silent for 3 centuries and cautious for 300 more days beyond that, opened wide across occupied space. Not a distress call, not a secret, but a signal, broadcast openly for anyone with the courage to listen. The Meridian's oath is awake, and this time it isn't going back to sleep. The war was not won. Humanity's remnant remained scattered, subjugated, and vastly outnumbered by an empire that had spent centuries perfecting the art of managing them into submission. But for the first time since the old war ended, they had something worth rallying behind, a ship, a crew, and a promise finally, fully answered.